Let me ask you something, and don't answer it casually. What would change in your life if quitting was no longer an option? Not unlikely, not I'll try, but impossible. Most people don't fail because they lack talent, intelligence, or opportunity. They fail because they leave a door open, a back door called just in case. What if in 2026 that door didn't exist? What if failure wasn't something you feared in 2026 because it simply wasn't available to you? No escape plan, no backup excuse, just one path, and you commit with everything you've got. Most people think change begins with motivation. They think if they just feel inspired enough, everything will shift. But motivation is unreliable. It comes and goes. It fades when you're tired, when things don't work, when life pushes back. Your nervous system doesn't organize itself around motivation. It organizes itself around certainty. And this is where almost everyone loses 2026 before it even begins. Your body is always asking one question: is this certain or is this a threat? If the outcome feels uncertain, your system hesitates. It holds back energy. It stays cautious. It looks for exits. But when something feels certain, your entire physiology aligns behind it. Your breathing changes. Your posture changes. Your focus sharpens. You stop negotiating with yourself. Think about it. You don't debate brushing your teeth. You don't wake up and say, let's see if I feel motivated to do this. It's certain, so there's no emotional drama around it. The same is true for the things you absolutely must do to survive. When certainty is present, action is automatic. Now here's the problem. Most people walk into a new year saying things like, I hope this works, or I'm going to try, or let's see what happens. And the nervous system hears uncertainty, it hears risk, it hears danger, and it responds by conserving energy instead of committing it. You don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your certainty. When you say failure is possible, even if you don't say it out loud, your body prepares for it. It builds hesitation into your actions. It keeps part of you safe instead of all of you committed. And that's why people start strong and fade fast. Not because they're weak, but because their system never believed it was non-negotiable. Now imagine something different. Imagine waking up every day in 2026 with the same internal certainty you'd have if your family depended on the outcome. Not emotional pressure, not stress, but clarity. The kind that says, this is happening. The only variable is how, when failure is removed as an option, the mind stops asking, what if this doesn't work? And starts asking, what else can I try? That's not positive thinking, that's survival wiring. Resourcefulness is a response to certainty. Look at any moment in your life where you showed up stronger than you thought possible. I guarantee you weren't calm because you felt motivated. You were strong because something was certain. You had to figure it out. You had no choice. And suddenly, energy appeared, ideas appeared, courage appeared. Not because you found them, but because certainty demanded them. This is why acting as if failure is impossible is not pretending. It's conditioning. It's training your nervous system to operate from commitment instead of caution. Your body doesn't understand the future. It understands decisions. When you decide something is non-negotiable, your system reorganizes around that decision. Your standards rise automatically. You stop tolerating behaviors that don't match the outcome. You don't need willpower to say no to distractions when the mission feels certain. And this is where people misunderstand confidence. Confidence isn't something you wait to feel. Confidence is the result of repeated certainty-based decisions. You move first, the feeling follows. Right now, if you're honest, there are areas of your life where you're talented, capable, even passionate, but not fully certain. You've left space to quit, space to delay, space to explain why it didn't work. And as long as that space exists, part of your energy leaks into protecting yourself instead of building momentum. Acting as if failure is impossible doesn't mean everything will go perfectly. It means you've decided in advance that obstacles are part of the path, not a reason to stop. It means setbacks don't threaten your identity, they're just feedback. When certainty is present, rejection doesn't crush you, it refines you. When certainty is present, delays don't discourage you, they sharpen your patience. When certainty is present, hard days don't knock you out, they remind you who you decided to be. Most people wait for evidence before they commit, but certainty comes first, evidence comes second. You don't need to know exactly how 2026 will unfold, you need to know who you are when it does, and that identity is built now. Through the decisions you make before results show up. Every time you choose to show up fully when it would be easier to pull back, you're training your nervous system to trust you. Every time you keep your word to yourself, certainty grows, and certainty is addictive in the best way. Once you feel it, you stop settling for half commitments. This is why standards matter more than goals. Goals are things you aim at. Standards are rules you live by. When your standard becomes, I do not quit, your behavior adjusts without force. You don't need to fight yourself. You've already decided. And here's the truth most people never hear. Failure is rarely caused by one big mistake. It's caused by thousands of small moments where certainty was missing. Moments where you hesitated, moments where you negotiated, moments where you waited to feel ready. 2026 does not require a better version of you. It requires a more decisive one. Decide that quitting is not available. Decide that excuses don't get airtime. Decide that discomfort is no longer a signal to stop, but a signal that growth is happening. And watch what your nervous system does when it finally believes you. Because the moment failure becomes impossible, effort stops feeling like effort. It becomes alignment. And when certainty takes over, everything else has no choice but to follow. Most people hear the phrase act as if and immediately misunderstand it. They think it means pretending, putting on a mask, hyping yourself up with words you don't believe yet. And if that's all it was, it wouldn't work. Your nervous system can't be fooled by fake confidence. It knows when you're just talking. But acting as if is not about pretending. It's about conditioning who you believe you are. Every action you take is a vote for an identity. Not the identity you say you want, but the identity you reinforce. You don't become confident and then act confidently. You act confidently and the nervous system updates the identity to match the behavior. That's how humans have always evolved. Behavior first, belief second. Right now, whether you realize it or not, you're already acting as if something is true. You act as if certain limits are real. You act as if certain outcomes are off the table. You act as if certain versions of you are unrealistic. And every day you repeat those actions, the identity gets stronger. So the question isn't whether you're acting as if. The question is what identity you're conditioning. Think about how people say, that's just not me, or I'm not the kind of person who does that. That sentence didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of consistent behavior that trained the nervous system to expect the same response. Identity is just familiarity repeated. And here's the breakthrough. Identity is not fixed. It's trained. When you act as if failure is impossible, you're not lying to yourself. You're placing your body in the posture of someone who has already decided. And the body always leads the mind. Change your posture, your breathing, your pace, your standards. And the brain scrambles to keep up with the new signal. This is why knowledge alone never transforms people. You can know exactly what to do and still not do it because the identity hasn't been conditioned yet. The nervous system still sees the old self as familiar and the new self as a threat. Acting as if is how you make the unfamiliar familiar. When you act as if you are disciplined, before you feel disciplined, your system begins to associate discipline with safety instead of struggle. When you act as if you are someone who follows through, even on small things, the identity starts to solidify. And once identity locks in, behavior becomes effortless. Most people wait for permission from their emotions. Once I feel confident, I'll speak up. Once I feel ready, I'll start. Once I believe in myself, I'll commit. But feelings follow behavior, not the other way around. If you wait for belief, you'll wait forever. The fastest way to believe something is to behave as if it's already true. Look at any role you've ever stepped into for the first time, a job, a responsibility, a leadership position. You didn't feel like that person on day one, but you showed up, did what was required, and over time the identity caught up. Eventually you stopped playing the role and started being the person. That's acting as if. In 2026, acting as if failure is impossible means you stop asking, do I feel like it? And start asking, what would the person who does not quit do next? And then you do that. Not once, not when it's convenient, but consistently enough that your nervous system updates the story of who you are. This is where standards come into play. Acting as if is not about big dramatic moments. It's about the small decisions no one sees. The moments when you could cut corners and don't. The moments when you could delay and choose not to. The moments when you could explain yourself and instead take responsibility. Every time you act in alignment with the identity you want, even when it's uncomfortable, you weaken the old identity. You teach your system this is who we are now. And at first it will feel unnatural. Of course it will. Growth always does. But discomfort, T is not a sign you're doing it wrong. It's a sign you're breaking a pattern. Most people misinterpret that discomfort as evidence they're not built for it. But it's the opposite. It's evidence the conditioning is working. Acting as if also removes the emotional roller coaster. You don't wake up asking how you feel. You wake up knowing who you are. And when identity is clear, emotions fall in line. You don't need constant encouragement when your behavior is tied to who you believe yourself to be. This is why people with strong identities seem unstoppable. They're not more motivated. They're more conditioned. They've acted in alignment with their standards so many times that deviation feels worse than discipline. And here's the key distinction. Acting as if failure is impossible does not mean denying reality. It means deciding in advance how you respond to reality. It means you no longer interpret obstacles as proof you should stop. You interpret them as part of the role you've already accepted. When challenges hit, you don't ask, why is this happening to me? You ask, how does someone like me handle this? That shift alone changes everything. Because the moment your identity becomes, I'm the kind of person who figures it out, your brain starts searching for solutions automatically. No drama, no self-pity, just movement. Over time, something powerful happens. The gap between acting and being disappears. You stop acting as if because you've become it. And once that happens, going back feels impossible. Not because you're forcing yourself forward, but because your standards won't allow retreat. This is how real change sticks. Not through willpower, not through hype, through identity-level conditioning. So in 2026, don't try to feel unstoppable. Act like the person who doesn't stop. Don't wait to believe you're capable. Move like someone who already decided, because when you act as if failure is impossible long enough, your nervous system stops treating it as an idea and starts treating it as truth. And once identity shifts, there's no turning back. Most people think failure is something that happens to them, like an event, like a moment where life shows up, points a finger and says, you didn't make it. But that's not how failure actually works. Failure is rarely a single moment. Failure is a decision, and it's almost always made far earlier than people realize. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, today I'm going to fail. What they do instead is decide quietly, subtly, that if it gets too hard, they'll stop. That if it hurts too much, they'll pull back. That if it doesn't work fast enough, they'll try something else. And the moment that decision exists, failure is already scheduled. It just hasn't shown up yet. That's why so many people look shocked when things don't work out. They say, I gave it everything. But if you look closely, there were conditions. I'll do this as long as it feels right. I'll push until I get discouraged. I'll commit unless I look foolish. Those are not strategies. Those are exit plans. The truth is, most people don't fail at the thing they're doing. They fail at staying. They fail at remaining committed when the emotional payoff disappears. They fail when the identity of who they thought they were collides with the reality of what growth actually demands. And here's the uncomfortable part. The moment you allow quitting to be a valid option, your mind starts preparing for it. It watches for justification. It looks for evidence that stopping would make sense. And once that evidence appears, the decision is already made. The rest is just explanation. Think about how many times you've heard someone say, I had no choice. That's almost never true. There was a choice. It just became emotionally expensive to keep choosing the harder path. So the mind reframed quitting as necessity instead of decision. Failure is not losing. Failure is deciding you're done before the outcome is determined. When you act as if failure is impossible, you remove that decision from the table. You don't debate it, you don't revisit it, you don't entertain it. And that changes everything, because now the only decisions left are tactical ones. What do I do next? How do I adjust? Who do I need to become? That's when resourcefulness turns on. People always ask how to become more resilient. They think it's about toughness or grit or being emotionally numb. It's not. Resilience comes from not having to decide whether to continue. When continuation is assumed, the nervous system stops wasting energy on doubt. Look at any long-term success story. What you'll find is not someone who never struggled, but someone who never gave themselves permission to quit when struggle arrived. They adapted, they learned, they recalibrated, but they stayed in the game. And staying in the game is the skill most people never master, because staying requires you to tolerate periods where you don't feel rewarded, where effort isn't matched with results, where doubt is louder than confidence. And if your identity is built around feeling good, you'll interpret those moments as failure. But if your identity is built around commitment, you'll interpret them as training. This is why failure feels so personal to people. They attach it to who they are instead of what they did. They say, I failed instead of that approach didn't work. And once failure becomes identity, quitting feels like relief. But when you understand that failure is simply a decision to stop experimenting, the emotional charge disappears. You're no longer protecting your ego, you're refining your approach. In 2026, the difference between those who win and those who don't will not be intelligence. It will not be luck. It will be who decides early that quitting is not an available response. That decision doesn't make things easier, it makes things clearer. When you remove quitting, frustration doesn't spiral into self-doubt. It turns into curiosity. You ask better questions. You seek feedback instead of validation. You stop taking things personally and start taking them seriously. Most people make the quitting decision in small moments. They skip one action, they delay one conversation, they lower one standard, and they tell themselves it doesn't matter. But it always matters because it reinforces the identity of someone who negotiates with pressure. Failure is not dramatic, it's subtle. It shows up as tolerance, tolerance for inconsistency, tolerance for excuses, tolerance for not showing up fully. And once tolerance becomes normal, the outcome is already decided. Acting as if failure is impossible means you catch those moments early. You notice when you're about to pull back. You notice when you're about to justify. And instead of arguing with yourself, you act in alignment with your decision, not because it feels good, because it's who you've decided to be. This is why people who succeed long-term seem calm under pressure. They're not calm because they're fearless. They're calm because they're not deciding their future in the middle of emotion. They already decided when they were clear. Clarity always beats emotion. If you decide in advance that discomfort is part of the path, it loses its power to derail you. If you decide in advance that setbacks are feedback, they stop feeling like rejection. If you decide in advance that quitting is not an option, failure low says its grip. And then something interesting happens. The thing you used to fear most becomes irrelevant. You stop worrying about failing because you're no longer measuring success by temporary outcomes. You're measuring it by whether you stayed true to your standards. That's real confidence. Not bravado, not hype. Confidence that comes from knowing you don't abandon yourself when it gets hard. So if you want 2026 to be different, don't wait to see how things go. Decide now how you go when things get hard. Because the moment you remove the decision to quit, failure doesn't stand a chance. Most people think their future is decided by the goals they set. They write them down, visualize them, talk about them, sometimes even get excited about them. And then months later, they're confused about why nothing really changed. The truth is, goals are important, but they're not what shape your life. Standards do. A goal is something you want. A standard is something you live by. Goals are external targets. Standards are internal rules. And the human nervous system responds far more powerfully to rules than to wishes. You can want something deeply and still not do what's required if your standards allow you to negotiate with yourself. Think about it. You might have a goal to be fit, but if your standard says I work out when I feel like it, that standard will always win. You might have a goal to build something meaningful, but if your standard says I stop when it gets overwhelming, that standard will quietly sabotage the goal every time. Standards are what you tolerate. Standards are what you allow. Standards are what you expect from yourself when no one is watching. And here's the key distinction. Goals are about outcomes. Standards are about identity. You don't rise to your goals, you fall to your standards. This is why two people can set the same goal and get completely different results. One person treats the goal as optional. The other treats the behaviors required to achieve it as non-negotiable. Same desire, different standards. In 2026, acting as if failure is impossible means you stop asking, what do I want? And start asking, what do I expect from myself, no matter what? Because expectation drives behavior far more consistently than desire. Most people have standards, they're just unconscious. They've set standards for how much effort is enough, how much discomfort is too much, how long they'll persist before questioning themselves. And because those standards were set during past experiences, they often don't match the future they say they want. If your standards were built in survival mode, they'll keep you safe but small. Raising standards doesn't require intensity. It requires clarity. You don't need to be aggressive with yourself. You need to be honest. Honest about where you've been negotiating. Honest about what you've been tolerating. Honest about the gap between what you say matters and what your behavior matters. When you raise your standards, you don't need more motivation. You don't need more inspiration. You simply remove certain options. You stop allowing yourself to act out of alignment with who you've decided to be. This is why people who change their standards change their lives almost overnight. Not because the world suddenly responds differently, but because they do. They stop returning calls that drain them. They stop skipping the actions that move the needle. They stop accepting excuses from themselves that used to sound reasonable. Standards create boundaries, and boundaries create freedom. When your standard becomes, I show up fully, even when it's uncomfortable, decision fatigue disappears. You're no longer asking whether to act. You're simply executing the standard. And that frees up mental and emotional energy for creativity and problem solving. Most people confuse discipline with punishment. But discipline is simply living in alignment with your standards. When your standards are clear, discipline feels natural. When they're vague, discipline feels like force. Acting as if failure is impossible means your standards are built around continuation, not comfort. You don't measure your day by how good it felt. You measure it by whether you honored your commitments. And that shift changes how you experience effort. effort stops feeling like sacrifice and starts feeling like integrity, there will be days in 2026 where you won't feel inspired. That's guaranteed. Inspiration is not the foundation of a great life. Standards are. On those days, your standards carry you when your emotions won't. This is also where self-respect is born. Self-respect doesn't come from success. It comes from consistency. It comes from knowing that you don't abandon your values when pressure shows up. And the more self-respect you have, the less you tolerate behaviors that don't match your future. Most people wait for confidence to raise their standards, but confidence comes after standards are raised. The moment you expect more from yourself, your identity begins to shift. You start seeing yourself as someone who follows through, someone who keeps promises, someone who doesn't settle. And once that identity takes hold, lowering your standards feels painful. Not because you're forcing yourself, but because it conflicts with who you've become. This is why goals alone are dangerous. You can hit a goal and still feel empty if your standards were low along the way. But when you live by high standards, even setbacks feel meaningful because you know you're growing. In 2026, don't just set goals, set rules for how you operate, rules for how you respond to challenges, rules for how you treat your time, your energy, and your word. Those rules will carry you further than any vision board ever could. Because when your standards say, I do not quit, I do not lower my effort, and I do not betray my commitments, failure has nowhere to land. Standards decide your future long before results ever show up. Most people think their lives are shaped by big decisions, the dramatic moments, the turning points they can point to and say, that's when everything changed. But those moments are rarely the cause. They're the result. Your life is actually shaped by the smallest actions you repeat when no one is watching. Every day you are voting for who you become, not with your intentions, not with your plans, with your actions. And the vote is never neutral. Every action either reinforces the identity you want or strengthens the identity you're trying to leave behind. There is no pause button. There is no, this doesn't count. It all cow and tease. This is why people can say they want a different future and still create the same one year after year. Their goals change, but their daily actions don't. An identity doesn't respond to what you want. It responds to what you do consistently. Think about it. You don't wake up one day and suddenly become disciplined. You become disciplined after hundreds of small moments where you chose action over comfort. You don't suddenly become confident. You become confident after repeatedly doing things that once scared you and surviving them. Identity is the accumulation of evidence, and your nervous system is always collecting evidence. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, even a small one, you cast a vote for the identity of someone who follows through. Every time you break a promise to yourself, even silently, you cast a vote for the identity of someone who negotiates. Over time, those votes stack up, and eventually the identity feels permanent. But it was never permanent. It was practiced. This is where people get stuck. They try to change their identity with massive gestures, big declarations, emotional breakthroughs, and those moments can be powerful. But if they're not followed by daily aligned action, the identity snaps back to what's familiar. Acting as if failure is impossible in 2026 means you stop looking for one defining moment and start respecting the power of the next small decision, what you do when you don't feel like it matters more than what you do when you're inspired. Anyone can act in alignment when motivation is high. Identity is built when motivation is low and standards still hold. This is where most people quietly sabotage themselves. They say, I'll start tomorrow, or I'll do it when things calm down, or this one time doesn't matter. And each time they say that, they teach their nervous system something. They teach it that comfort outranks commitment, that emotion outranks decision, and that lesson doesn't disappear. It compounds. But the same is true in the opposite direction. One workout when you didn't feel like it, one hard conversation you didn't avoid, one focused hour instead of distraction. Those moments don't just move the needle on results, they reshape how you see yourself. And when self-image changes, behavior follows automatically. This is why willpower eventually fails. Willpower is a temporary push against identity. Identity always wins in the long run. So the real work is not forcing yourself to do more. It's becoming someone who naturally does what's required. And that happens through daily votes. You don't need to overhaul your life overnight. You need to win the next vote, and then the next one, and then another. Momentum is built through accumulation, not intensity. In 2026, if failure is truly impossible, then every day becomes a question, what does someone who doesn't quit do today? Not in theory, in action. And then you do that even if it's imperfect. This removes pressure. You're not trying to prove anything. You're simply reinforcing an identity. Most people underestimate how powerful this is because the actions look small. But identity doesn't care about size, it cares about consistency. 5 minutes a day done every day beats 5 hours done once a month because the nervous system responds to repetition. And once identity shifts, something remarkable happens. You stop arguing with yourself. You stop needing external accountability. You stop relying on mood. You act because that's what people like you do. This is why people who have changed deeply don't talk about motivation anymore. They talk about standards. They talk about routines. They talk about habits, not because they're boring, but because they're free. They're no longer negotiating their future every morning. Your daily actions are shaping what you believe is possible for you. When you act small, you think small. When you act with integrity, you think with confidence. Thought follows action far more than action follows thought. And here's the part most people miss. Even inaction is a vote. Even avoidance is a vote. Even scrolling instead of starting is a vote. The system doesn't judge, it just records. So if you don't like the identity you're reinforcing, you don't need to shame yourself. You need to change the next action. One vote won't define you, but enough of them will. This is how people rebuild trust with themselves, not by making promises they hope to keep, but by taking actions they know they can repeat. Trust grows when your behavior becomes predictable to your own nervous system, and trust creates confidence. In 2026, the question is not whether you're capable. The question is what identity you're feeding every day, because the identity you feed will eventually take over. So stop waiting for a breakthrough. Become the breakthrough through your actions. Win the small moments, stack the votes, let identity catch up. Because when your daily actions consistently vote for the person who doesn't quit, failure doesn't just become unlikely, it becomes irrelevant. There's a moment that comes for everyone who commits fully, a moment where the plan stops working, where the strategy you trusted hits a wall, where effort doesn't produce the outcome you expected. And in that moment, most people think they've reached the edge of their ability. They haven't. They've reached the edge of their options. As long as quitting exists as an option, the mind uses it, not dramatically, quietly. It starts conserving energy. It starts pulling back. It starts protecting you from disappointment. And you feel it as confusion, hesitation, or burnout. But the moment quitting is removed, something entirely different happens. Resourcefulness takes over. This isn't motivational theory. It's human wiring. When the brain knows there is no escape route, it stops asking whether you can handle it and starts asking how. Creativity switches on. Focus sharp. Our pens. You begin to see possibilities that were invisible when comfort was still available. Think about the times in your life when you surprised yourself, when you handled something you once believed you couldn't. Those moments didn't come from perfect preparation. They came from necessity, from a situation where backing out wasn't an option. You figured it out because you had to. That's the power you unlock when you act as if failure is impossible. Most people never access their full resourcefulness because they've never removed the safety net. They keep a version of themselves reserved for retreat, and that version quietly competes with the one trying to move forward. Energy gets split, focus gets diluted, but when there is no retreat, energy consolidates. This is why people with limited resources often outperform people with abundant ones. It's not because they're smarter, it's because they're more committed. They don't have the luxury of indecision. They move, adjust, and persist because stopping isn't an option. In 2026, when something doesn't work, you don't get to say, I guess this isn't for me. You say, that approach didn't work. What else can? That one shift keeps momentum alive. You stay in motion, and motion creates feedback. Feedback creates improvement. Quitting kills feedback. And without feedback, growth dies. Resourcefulness is not about having more tools. It's about using what you have differently. When quitting is removed, you stop waiting for ideal conditions. You use the time you have. You leverage the skills you've built. You reach out instead of isolating. You ask better questions because the old ones don't serve you anymore. This is where leadership is born, not leadership over others, but leadership over yourself. You stop outsourcing responsibility to circumstances. You stop blaming timing, people, or luck. Not because those things don't matter, but because they no longer control your response. When quitting is off the table, pressure becomes fuel. Not because pressure feels good, but because it focuses you. You stop wasting energy on emotional noise. You get precise. You simplify. You execute. Most people think pressure breaks them. Pressure only breaks people who haven't decided. For those who have pressure, it clarifies. This is also where fear changes shape. Fear doesn't disappear when quitting is removed. It transforms. It stops being a signal to stop and becomes information to use. You notice it, adjust your approach, and keep moving. And over time, something powerful happens. You start trusting yourself in uncertainty. You realize you don't need guarantees to move forward. You only need commitment. And that trust compounds into confidence that doesn't depend on outcomes. People often ask how to stay motivated when things get hard. The truth is you don't. Motivation is irrelevant when resourcefulness is engaged. You're not trying to feel good, you're trying to move forward. And movement itself generates energy. This is why action precedes clarity. You don't wait to feel certain. You act, learn, adapt, and certainty grows through experience. The more problems you solve, the more capable you feel. The more capable you feel, the less you fear the next obstacle. Removing quitting doesn't trap you, it frees you. It frees you from the endless loop of second guessing. It frees you from asking whether you should continue. You already decided. Now you get to focus on how to win. And winning doesn't always mean immediate success. Sometimes it means surviving a season that would have broken the old version of you. Sometimes it means building strength quietly while nothing looks impressive on the outside. But here's what always happens when resourcefulness takes over. You grow faster than you ever thought possible, not because life gets easier, but because you get better at handling difficulty. In 2026, challenges will show up. That's not optional. What is optional is how many options you give yourself. If quitting is one of them, it will eventually be used. If it's removed, your mind will rise to the occasion. You don't need more talent. You don't need more confidence. You don't need a perfect plan. You need a decision so firm that your nervous system stops looking for exits. Because when there is no way out, there is always a way through. And once you experience that level of resourcefulness, you never look at obstacles the same way again.